Tonight, protests and boycotts in the U.S. Capitol as Israel's Prime Minister addresses Congress. There was, at times, rapturous applause for Benjamin Netanyahu, but dozens of members of Congress refused to attend as he vowed to keep fighting Hamas and rescue all hostages.
I will not rest until all their loved ones are home. All of them.
Outside, police deployed pepper spray and arrested protesters showing their anger towards a man wanted for alleged war crimes in Gaza. But Netanyahu said they were the enemy.
You have officially become Iran's useful idiots.
As that drama unfolded, dozens of Gazan children injured in the war were transferred to Spain. The first evacuations to Europe will bring you the latest on their condition. Plus,
we have one shooter deceased. I think it's 3 victims.
New body cam footage and evidence from the head of the FBI sheds more light on the day Donald Trump almost died.
He did a Google search for, quote, how far away was Oswald from Kennedy?
Also tonight, an Oval Office address from President Biden on his legacy and how he was convinced to quit. That's all coming up on The World with me, Yalda Hakim. Good evening and welcome to this special edition of The World with me, Yalda Hakim, live here from Washington. And it has been yet another day of high drama. We've been reporting here on the ground for the last couple of weeks, covering every twist and turn since that assassination attempt on Donald Trump through to the Republican National Convention. Then, of course, Joe Biden stepping down from his position as the Democratic nominee for president in November's election. Kamala Harris then picking up on that momentum. And when you thought things couldn't get even more dramatic, Israel's Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, a trip that was already scheduled in, arrives in this high-stakes and dramatic week to address both houses of Congress. He made that address a little over an hour ago. He was supposed to speak for 30 to 40 minutes, but he lasted about an hour. He covered a range of issues, from the protesters who have been outside, and they're still outside, and we're going to go to that in a moment, to the alliance between the United States and Israel, saying that they need to stand together. Well, let's look at some of those demonstrations that are just taking place. In fact, they were just behind me here near the Capitol about an hour or so ago. There's a lot of security where I am at the moment. And just on that side, we can see Union Square Station. You can see these live images at the moment. A lot of police, riot police, are gathered there as well. We were told earlier that tear gas was being used. We saw some of those demonstrators recovering from that tear gas. These protesters have been chanting, "Free, free Palestine." They've been holding up placards describing Benjamin Netanyahu as a war criminal. And of course, that's just a reminder of that arrest warrant for Benjamin Netanyahu by the International Criminal Court. And America doesn't recognize that court. So, of course, because of those historical strong ties, Benjamin Netanyahu was invited here by the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, who invited Benjamin Netanyahu here. His first trip since that war began with Gaza 9 months ago. 39,000 people dead. Let's just have a little listen to what Benjamin Netanyahu had to say just over an hour ago.
The pain these families have endured is beyond words. I met with them again yesterday, and I promised them this: I will not rest until all their loved ones are home. All of them. We're actively engaged in intensive efforts to secure their release, and I'm confident that these efforts can succeed. Some of them are taking place right now.
Applause punctuating every statement that Benjamin Netanyahu had. He then looked to both sides of Congress, and he had a message, he said, for the protesters outside. Have a listen.
These protesters, stand with them. They should be ashamed of themselves. Iran is funding the anti-Israel protests that are going on right now outside this building. Not that many, but they're there, and throughout the city. Well, I have a message for these protesters. When the tyrants of Tehran, who hang gays from cranes and murder women for not covering their hair, are praising, promoting, and funding you, you have officially become Iran's useful idiots.
Well, as I was saying earlier, the International Criminal Court, of course, has issued an arrest warrant for Mr. Netanyahu. He launched an attack on the ICC, accused the ICC of lies after it issued that arrest warrant. Just have a listen.
The ICC prosecutor accuses Israel of deliberately targeting civilians. What in God's green earth is he talking about? I want to thank all of you here today who forcefully opposed the false accusations of the ICC and stood up for the truth. These lies are not only libelous, they're downright dangerous. The ICC is trying to shackle Israel's hands and prevent us from defending ourselves. And if Israel's hands are tied, America is next.
Well, Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is due to meet with President Joe Biden tomorrow. Some of the notable absentees who weren't present during his speech, of course, former Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi, as well as Vice President Kamala Harris. She says she's currently on the campaign trail in Indianapolis, but she's also due to meet him in the next day or so. And of course, Benjamin Netanyahu will head to Mar-a-Lago in Florida and meet with Donald Trump as well on Friday. But right now, you are looking at those live images just where I am, in fact, here in Washington, outside by the Capitol and by Union Square Station. Police gathered around those protesters. There are thousands of people here holding placards that describe Benjamin Netanyahu as a war criminal, outraged that he's been invited to speak and address Congress. And as I said, there were Democratic lawmakers who stayed away from this address today. Although when you looked at the space there, it looked quite full. They weren't all members of Congress. They had brought in other people, we're told, to fill the space in. But as I said, applause punctuating every sentence that Benjamin Netanyahu made. This is as much about his political survival as well. He's trying to show a level of strength here. It's his first trip here to the United States since the war began. Fourth time he's addressing Congress. Let's bring in our James Matthews. Now, James, I can hear the helicopters above. And of course, the police down below. There are still hundreds, if not thousands, of people in the streets.
Yeah, several thousand, Yalda. I'm walking down Constitution Avenue, about a mile from where you are, something like 600-700 meters from where the Capitol building is. And that is clearly the concern of law enforcement in this town. If we look that way, you can see the fences fencing off the Capitol. And beyond that, police officers in riot gear. I have to say, in amongst this crowd, they are walking peacefully, very loud. Police officers taking a lot of abuse. But in terms of what I've seen in the past half hour, it's been a peaceful march along Constitution Avenue, away from the Capitol. There have been clashes of sorts earlier on with police when demonstrators and police officers came together. Officers used pepper spray to deter them. So that happened earlier on. It also happened after the Netanyahu speech at the tail end of the protest, when demonstrators gathered outside Union Station in the center of Washington, D.C. They ripped down American flags, burnt them, and there was also the burning of an effigy of Benjamin Netanyahu. So at that point, officers moved in and pepper spray was again used, officers in riot gear with protective face masks and so on. But if you take a look down that way, you can see the demonstration as it stands at the moment. They came up this way towards the Capitol earlier on before Netanyahu's speech, gathered outside Union Station and are now making their way down the street away from the Capitol, now something like a kilometre away from the Capitol building. No suggestion from any of these demonstrators that they were targeting the Capitol itself, but clearly that's where Netanyahu was. That's where America's politicians were gathered for that address. And in this town, they don't need any reminders about invasions of that seat of power. Indeed, only yesterday, there was a protest, a peaceful protest, inside the rotunda at the Capitol, where protesters gathered to make their point, a similar point, against Netanyahu, his presence and everything that, for them, he represents. And you can take a look at that sign. That's what he represents to the majority of those gathered here today. They accuse Netanyahu of being a war criminal, of genocide. That's the point they have come to make in the streets today. That was a point made in the Capitol building itself by Democrats, politicians who stayed away in protest at Netanyahu's presence. Not present in that chamber, of course, was Kamala Harris. She was elsewhere campaigning in Indianapolis. Normally, she would be sitting on the speaker's forum behind the invited guests as a gesture of welcoming, as a gesture of welcome and respect. She says that she was otherwise engaged, convenient perhaps, given the division inside the Democratic Party about Gaza, policy on Gaza, America's support for Israel and supply of weapons and so on. It's a tricky one. Has been a tricky one for Joe Biden. It will be tricky for Kamala Harris moving forward. And of course, Netanyahu, you take a look that way, we can see the gathered throng static now, still several hundred strong. It's going to be tricky for Kamala Harris moving forward, but more immediately, tricky for Biden. He has a meeting with Netanyahu tomorrow in the White House. He's invited his Secretary of State to be present, delaying a foreign trip. He's invited the families of American hostages to be there, all part of an effort by Biden to lean on Netanyahu to reach a ceasefire, to reach a deal that would represent progress in the Middle East. On the back of the speech that we heard from Netanyahu, Yalda, I have to say that would appear to be a slim hope right now. Not one mention of ceasefire in that speech lasting nearly an hour from the Israeli Prime Minister.
Yeah, and in many ways, James, in this difficult week that we've seen for Joe Biden, extraordinary that Benjamin Netanyahu's arrival has really haunted and reminded people here in the United States of the challenges that Joe Biden has had with Benjamin Netanyahu. During his speech, he thanked Joe Biden for his support and talked about the decades-long relationship that they have had. But in the last 9 or so months, that relationship has had some very challenging moments. You spoke there of his Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, making several trips to Israel, to the region, to try and bring both sides together. But this remains a sore point for Joe Biden, because he would want, as part of his legacy, to see that kind of peace that he longed for in the Middle East. But it has created so many divisions here in the United States.
Yeah, it has, and we see that just looking around. We see division. We also see that element that has dogged Joe Biden for months over the course of the Middle East conflict, and his stewardship of it, and his attempts to try to bring about some kind of resolution. These scenes, these protests and protesters, they evoke memories of protests that we've seen sometimes violent over the course of recent months on American college campuses and so on. A protest, a group of demonstrators of a younger generation, many of whom have turned their back on Biden because of the Middle East conflict. And you look at the the campaign, abandon Biden in places like Michigan, a swing state. He has suffered politically and domestically because of what is happening under his stewardship. He has been seen to have a lack of authority and a lack of leadership in terms of shaping world events. That has weakened him. And we're reminded of that today in these scenes of demonstrations, in the empty chairs we saw inside the Capitol building, and in the words of Benjamin Netanyahu. There was nothing in what Netanyahu, a belligerent Netanyahu, said that gave us any hint he is of a mind to meet the moment with Joe Biden and to meet the expectations, hope more than expectation, of any kind of agreement that amounts to anything resembling progress towards peace. Remember, Netanyahu and Biden, they are two men who loathe each other. Biden is invested in his legacy, but Netanyahu is by no means invested in giving Biden his crowning moment as he makes his way out the door of the Oval Office. So to that extent, Biden is on the back foot. But there's also the business of the longer term. What would it be worth for Biden and Netanyahu to reach some kind of agreement tomorrow or in the short term, given that Biden's only got 6 months left? And who knows who could be in the White House after November. For that very reason, Netanyahu has scheduled a meeting with Donald Trump. He's flying to Mar-a-Lago in Florida on Friday, and buoyed by the support he's had from the Republican Party, who's to say that he doesn't regard Trump as the better prospect for reaching some kind of deal with, because Trump looks like, in terms of the polls, he could be the president come November, but a deal with Trump, more so than with Biden, might factor in the long-term political survival for Benjamin Netanyahu, which of course he wants and which is in jeopardy given growing opposition that he faces back home.
Yeah, James, as you say, for Biden, it might be about legacy. For Netanyahu, it is about political survival. And let's bring in the perspective on that speech from the Middle East. Let's speak to our John Sparks, who's there in Jerusalem for us. And John, it's quite late in the evening there in Israel, in Jerusalem as well. But just give us a sense, has there been reaction to Netanyahu's speech?
Well, early days, but look, you know, he's not a popular figure in Israel. There are lots of people who didn't want him to go. They didn't want it. They accused him of grandstanding making this trip. A lot of people wanted him to stay here to work on securing the hostages. There is a view that the best way to do that is to come up with a ceasefire deal with Hamas to get the hostages out. So yeah, people unhappy, a lot of people unhappy that he is in the United States speaking to Congress. They think he's grandstanding, that he's wasting his time that could be better spent elsewhere doing other things. And, you know, listening to the speech, though, I thought bellicose, loud, proud, utterly unapologetic. I thought, interestingly, that Netanyahu was trying to bind Israel and the United States in an ever-tightening embrace. And he really expanded on his worldview, didn't he? He said Iran was behind virtually all of the chaos, the killing, the terrorism in the Middle East. He said it was Israel that was protecting the United States from Iran. Without Israel, he said, the Americans might have to put boots on the ground in the Middle East. And then he got to his asks in the speech. And boy, did he have asks. He wants the Americans to expedite weapons deliveries to Israel so they can finish the job against Hamas. And he really reflected on the fact that Israel is increasingly isolated in the world. He went on at length about the ICC, the International Criminal Court, the prosecutor there seeking an arrest warrant against Netanyahu for war crimes. Again, he is seeking American friendship and support. And then I thought, interestingly, there were the things that he didn't talk about at all, like a ceasefire. We know that negotiators are working on a ceasefire deal. American negotiators say that the parties are close to a deal. But you know what? Netanyahu did not sound like a man who was ready to put pen to paper to sign up to any sort of truce. The very opposite, in fact. He said he was committed to total victory against Hamas.
And the pressure, though, from families of the hostages in Israel is mounting on Benjamin Netanyahu for some kind of deal to be reached. We've seen those demonstrations in Tel Aviv, in Jerusalem, asking him to take action, to do something. And like you say, it doesn't appear at this stage like he is willing to strike that deal.
No, it really doesn't. He didn't talk about the prospects of any kind of negotiated settlement, any sort of negotiation in that speech at all. He was talking about his total and utter commitment to victory against Hamas, and he said it was the Americans' responsibility to help him do it. Yet he is under huge political pressure here, but he has been able to resist it since the very beginning of the conflict. He has been able to do that. He has people who sit to the right of him in his administration. They say that they will withdraw their support from Benjamin Netanyahu. So he is, in a sense, in the middle of a very complex political situation here with multiple factions to the left of him, to the right. His supporters on the right say, do a peace deal, come up with a ceasefire with Hamas, and we'll withdraw our support and your government will fall. But certainly the argument that has been made by many people, including Biden, is that he looks like he is trying to extend the war to maintain his position in power. Still, Netanyahu today, he looked like he was fully committed to continuing the fight. I don't think there's any doubt about that.
A fight that has lasted 9 months and 39,000 dead in Gaza.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, let's talk about tonight. Let's talk about the last couple of days, shall we? The Israelis engaged in major operations around the city of Rafah. Again, while we understand that negotiators are busy in Cairo, busy in Qatar. We understand that an Israeli negotiation team is ready to fly out to Qatar perhaps on Thursday to tie up some sort of deal. But simultaneously, I can tell you that the Israelis are engaged in major operations in Gaza, around Rafah in the south, around the city of Khan Yunis in central Gaza. And while Netanyahu was speaking tonight in Washington, airstrikes in northern Gaza as well. More than 100 people, 129 according to the Gaza Health Ministry, have been killed in the last couple of days. So, this war, it's not ending, it's continuing. In fact, what we're hearing is that there has been a real intensification over the last couple of weeks.
Yeah, an incredibly challenging and difficult, devastating situation for Gazans there, and they would remain further devastated listening to Benjamin Netanyahu address Congress here in the United States, as have the protesters who have gathered here, thousands, John, who have gathered here and remain on the streets protesting outside of Congress. They weren't able to get anywhere near it, but in and around the area.
Yeah, I mean, extraordinary. I mean, he is one of the most divisive figures in world politics, isn't he? He is one of the most divisive leaders in the world. But as we heard in that speech, he's not making any apologies for it. He's got a position, he's got a philosophy, which he expounded on in his speech, that Iran is behind the terrorism, the chaos, the killings in the Middle East. It does it, he said, through its axis of evil by supporting groups like Hamas in Gaza, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen. It is the Iranians who are behind everything. And he said they can be defeated. They will be defeated. That Israel and the Americans can and will do it together. But again, seeking to bind the Americans into an ever closer relationship with the Israelis. I am sure in the United States that will make very uncomfortable listening for people in the political center, for people on the political left.
Yeah, and as you've been reporting, John, as we've all been reporting for the last 9 months on the situation in Gaza, we've also talked at length about the tens of thousands of children that have been left injured and in desperate need of medical attention. Well, let's speak now to someone who can join us from Madrid tonight and who is helping children be evacuated out of Gaza and to Spain. Tareq, Hailat, who heads the Treatment Abroad program for the Palestine Children's Relief Fund. Thank you very much, Tareq, for joining us here on the program. I first of all want to get your reaction to what we were hearing. I don't know if you heard Benjamin Netanyahu's speech to Congress, but he talked about the effort that his government, Israel, has been making to get aid into Gaza. He talked about the situation in Gaza not being one of famine. Just tell us about what you've been seeing and the people that you've been speaking to, of course, and the children that you've evacuated.
Yeah, of course. Well, first of all, thank you for having me. I think this is an extremely important topic to talk about. Just an hour and a half ago, I welcomed the children here in Madrid, and it was an extremely emotional moment. You know, you're extremely excited to see these children that are finally going to receive the treatment that they deserve. But at the same time, you have a sense of guilt because while these 15 children were extremely lucky to be able to be brought here, there's thousands and thousands inside of Gaza that need desperate help. And actually, even this mission itself, I mean, it was an amazing mission between us and the World Health Organization and the European Union. Even this mission, we shifted our focus from patients that we've already evacuated from Gaza prior to the Rafah border being occupied. And the reason for that is because it was so difficult to pull them out from Gaza. I mean, for the past few months, we've only been able to pull one of our children from Gaza.
Yeah, I mean, as you say, the 15, it's extraordinary that you've been able to get them to Spain. But a drop in the ocean, the kinds of injuries that we are hearing about. We've spoken to doctors who have been inside Gaza, have treated those children, have talked about the sorts of disabilities that these children are dealing with and the sorts of diseases they face now.
Yeah, of course. And the thing is, we have to think about it a little bit broader, right? Because there's wounds of war and there's people that have chronic conditions that due to the crippling healthcare system that's happening currently in Gaza, they are also impacted as well. And those are the silent voices, the voices that people aren't necessarily paying to as much attention to. And and PCRF as a whole wants to focus on all the children, all those that are injured, whether it's chronic or wounds of war. And I think that's an extremely important point that I wanna highlight. But more importantly, is that any trauma, injury, that even at the slightest injury can turn into something drastic, right? A particular child could, for example, have a fracture. That fracture could get infected. That infection then can become an amputation. That amputation can get infected. Then now you have an entire person that could possibly die from a simple fracture. And that is really the important point, that not just because a person has an extremely traumatic injury that this is serious. No, it's serious even when it's just a simple fracture, because the crippling healthcare system inside of Gaza does not even allow for a child who has a simple fracture to treat it, you know?
Yeah, indeed, as you say, I mean, it's crippling, it's collapsed. There aren't any real facilities there for children to get the kind of urgent care that they have. Have your teams also been taking children out across the region? I know that this group of children you've brought to Spain, but I'm talking mainly about within the region in the Middle East.
Yes. So thankfully, PCRF has been the organization that's pulled the most amount of children outside of Gaza for treatment outside of Egypt. So we've gotten to countries like Qatar, the UAE, Jordan, Lebanon, the United States, which is not very regional, but we've also been there. We're trying to open up to more places. And I think that's a really important point, is while we are continuing to take children to these places that have already opened up, why this mission is so critical is because it pioneers opening of bringing children to new countries. The European countries are important, and we actually really appreciate the initiative here by Spain. And we are very welcoming of it, and we hope that other European countries are going to follow suit. Currently, in the next few weeks, we are going to be hopefully bringing children to other European countries like Belgium, Norway, Italy, etc.
Okay, I'm sure there are many people who are extremely grateful for the work that you're doing and all of your efforts and that of your organization. Tareq, Hailat, thank you very much for joining us here on the program.
Thank you so much for covering it.
Well, let's just take a closer look at what's happening back on the ground in Gaza. And just a warning to our viewers, this report from our international correspondent John Sparks does contain distressing images. Just have a look.
The war in Gaza knows no boundaries, with thousands of children amongst the casualties. Here in Madrid, specialist staff receive boys and girls with shattered limbs and extensive burns, 16 in total, who've been evacuated from the battered enclave to Europe. These are the children who will receive no treatment at home. In truth, there's not much that doctors in Gaza can do. In Deir al-Balah, the victims of an airstrike are wheeled into the emergency room. But the staff are quickly overwhelmed. Not enough doctors, not enough beds, and a critical shortage of medical supplies like bandages. Around the back, lifeless bodies are zipped into plastic bags while their loved ones say their goodbyes. It's a pattern we see replicated at the only hospital still functioning in Khan Yunis. Bodies prepared for burial on the pavement, people living and sleeping at the side. The Israeli Defense Force has mounted a sizable operation in this city.
We sleep on the streets, we sleep on the sand, we sleep against one wall or another, one tree or another.
The IDF says Hamas is using Khan Yunis as a base to reassemble their fighters, and they've launched a series of assaults. Attacks that have killed scores of people in the city, despite the fact that much of it was designated a safe zone. According to the UN, more than 150,000 have been forced to flee from one dust-filled hovel to another. Our team filmed as they headed west to another so-called safe zone called Al-Mawasi.
Right now, they're shooting at us. Over there, snipers shooting at us. Look at the people. Look now. Look, they're running.
They were scared and disorientated. Some said they'd been displaced 10 or more times. A man screams in the street, "God help us, God help us." We just started walking. We don't know where we're walking. Are we going to the sea or are we moving towards death? Benjamin Netanyahu has been granted the red carpet in Washington, D.C., an audience with the most powerful politicians in the world. In Gaza, civilians drag their possessions to another patch of earth, their world devoid of hope. John Sparks, Sky News in Jerusalem.
Devastating situation for all of those Gazans who continue to be on the move months into this conflict. And while there have been some encouraging news, as we heard there, about children being evacuated, a very small number of children being evacuated for treatment, there are also other major concerns about a possible outbreak of polio. Now, that's after traces were found in wastewater in Gaza. The World Health Organization is saying there's a high risk of the virus spreading. Well, joining me now is Dr. Hamid Jafari, Director of Polio Eradication at the World Health Organization Eastern Mediterranean Office. Thank you, Doctor, for joining us here on the program. I mean, the situation for the people of Gaza, the devastation, the heartbreak doesn't seem to be ending. And then, of course, these real issues, not just the injuries that they're sustaining from the conflict, but the diseases that they face, and now polio.
No, we are extremely worried about the detection of polio virus. in the environmental samples, the sewage samples from two places in Gaza, from Deir al-Balah in the north and then Khan Yunis. 6 samples have turned positive with polio virus. And the conditions in Gaza, as you're showing here, open sewage. This is a virus that is transmitted through fecal contamination. It's fecal-oral transmission. And with this overcrowding and people getting displaced, with declining immunization rates, hospital services, less than half of the hospitals are functioning, less than half of the health centers that provide vaccination are functioning. This is an environment where polio virus transmission can take off, while so far a case of paralytic polio has not been reported. And it may be that we have not detected it yet because the surveillance system is also suspended, is disrupted for detecting cases of acute flaccid paralysis, which is the system that tells us about the presence of polio. So that's disrupted as well. So there is a very high risk of this transmission intensifying, paralyzing young children, and then spreading internationally.
Internationally, Doctor, I have seen the impact of polio, of course, on the youngest of victims in places like Pakistan, for example. But just give our viewers a sense of what happens, and it's children that are impacted by this.
So exactly. So, and especially in Gaza, Gaza used to have a very, very high rate of immunization against polio. It was around over 95%, estimated 99% in 2022. It has declined to around 86% now. And the decline means that it is making the youngest children most vulnerable because they are not receiving their childhood vaccines, the infants, the less than 2-year-olds. And they're the ones who are at the highest risk for developing paralytic polio. And then if an outbreak of paralytic polio starts with virus transmitting extensively in these crowded conditions, unsafe water, and sewage all around them, this is a recipe for a major paralytic polio outbreak.
Indeed, very much so. We're grateful for your time, Dr. Hamid Jafari from the World Health Organization.
Thank you.
Now you're watching The World with me, Yalda Hakim. Next up, we've been reporting the events of the last week. Well, as Joe Biden gets ready to address the nation later this evening, we'll discuss how his monumental decision has turned this presidential race on its head. That's coming up. Welcome back to The World with Yalda Hakim, live here in Washington. And we've been following all the events of the past week. And of course, we've also been reporting on the assassination attempt on Donald Trump. Now, it's emerged the gunman who tried to assassinate the former president had previously searched online about the killing of former President JFK, John F. Kennedy. The revelation emerged in testimony from the FBI director, Christopher Wray. Meanwhile, new body camera footage has emerged, raising more questions about the operation on the day by the Secret Service and other authorities. There have been a lot of discussions about the failure of the Secret Service. And of course, we saw the director of the Secret Service stepping down. This report by our David Blevins.
Yes, that they sent yes, Beaver County sniper seen and sent the pictures out. This is him.
This was the moment police officers showed the Secret Service the body of the would-be assassin.
We don't know. We don't know.
The awareness of Thomas Crooks, confirmation that local law enforcement had identified him as suspicious before the shooting of Donald Trump.
That's the sniper that sent the original pictures and seen him come from the bike and set the book bag down and then lost sight of him.
The confusion and communication problems that led to an unthinkable breach in security evident.
Detain those guys, find out what they know, who they are, whatever. I'm trying to get clear information to relay back to D.C.
The committee will come to order with.
Now, the head of the FBI, the latest figure to be grilled on Capitol Hill over how this happened.
The attempted assassination of the former president was an attack on our democracy and our democratic process, and we will not and do not tolerate political violence of any kind, especially a despicable account of this magnitude.
The shooting was the first attempted murder of a president or former president in more than 4 decades. The director of the FBI revealing that part of the weapon was collapsible, making it easier to conceal, and that the gunman had researched online details related to the assassination of President John F. Kennedy.
Analysis of a laptop that the investigation ties to the shooter reveals that on July 6th, he did a Google search for, quote, how far away was Oswald from Kennedy?
The interrogation of Kimberly Cheetle earlier this week failed to satisfy members of Congress, signalling the end of her tenure as Secret Service director.
We have one shooter deceased. I think we have 3 victims in the crowd. Is that, you guys hearing that too?
They're still attempting to piece it together, but as more information becomes available, more questions arise about how this could happen so close to an election when America should be on high alert. David Blevins, Sky News in Washington.
And of course, David is here with me now. David, just a couple of days ago, we saw the Secret Service director being forced to step down from her position. Christopher Wray, the FBI director, was also grilled. He seemed to come more prepared this time.
Yes, the answers were definitely more forthcoming. The congressmen and senators who formed the committee seemed more content with the detail they were receiving. He revealed that the part of the weapon was collapsible so it could be concealed. He also revealed, as we've heard, that the gunman had done some research online in relation to the assassination of John F. Kennedy back in 1963. But to some extent, it feels like the more we learn, the less we know about the events surrounding the attempted assassination of Donald Trump on July 13th, because this body cam footage is revealing that certainly local law enforcement had identified Thomas Crooks as a viable threat. They'd relayed that information to some extent to the Secret Service. It had reached one of the snipers. He had him in his sights for a short time, but then due to some communication failure, lost sight of him moments before he opened fire. So still lots of questions.
Lots of questions. The protests continue here. And of course, the issue around Joe Biden, we're expecting to hear from him this evening, and we will be covering that. The woman he has endorsed, Kamala Harris, on the campaign trail, and the entire party and machinery has moved with her.
It's incredible. There's just so much going on right now. Kamala Harris in Indiana, one of the critical states in the Midwest, of course, that she will want to win. She's addressing a key demographic, women of colour. They will need to vote for her if she's to become the first woman to win the White House. And within the last few minutes, the Democratic Party's Rules Committee has confirmed that it hopes to be in a position to formally nominate her by the 1st of August. That's 19 days before the National Convention in Chicago, and that she will be in a position to name her running mate by August 7th. So they're going to try and wrap this up very quickly. That's not a surprise. And of course, while all of that's going on, Joe Biden is preparing to address the nation. It will be just the 4th time he has addressed the nation from the Oval Office. And he's going to be attempting to strike a balance between passing the baton to Kamala Harris and also reasserting his own authority as president for another 6 months.
Indeed, and of course we will be covering that extensively. David, thank you so much for all of your coverage there. And as David was saying, things moving incredibly quickly. Kamala Harris potentially being nominated by August the 1st, and we will have full coverage of Joe Biden's speech addressing the nation this evening, 1 a.m. UK time, prime time here at 8 p.m. In the United States. Now you're watching The World with me, Yalda Hakim. Next up, my colleague Mark Austin will be joining me here live to discuss Benjamin Netanyahu's historic and controversial address to Congress. We'll be talking about what it all means and the impact of it. My name is Oksana, and I'm Ukrainian Olympian for Ukraine 2008. I've been invited to speak about this big issue, big problem in my country, what's going on right now. And this number, 487, that's a huge number for me to even say. Yeah. But I was there on behalf of all of these athletes whose dream was killed by Russian army, and their names sadly in the dead list, but the name should be in the list of sports history of Ukraine. But the message for all of this, how I understand, just to stop the war and stop this number to be raised, because there's still 4,000 athletes at the front line fighting. So if we can do anything to make this war stop, that's going to be great. I think they will be happily proud that somebody is speaking about this problem. I'm sure they're dreaming about the day when the war will be over and they can continue competing and represent their country on the biggest world arenas. I have lots of friends because I studied in a boarding school, so there wasn't on. So my sport is wrestling, but there wasn't only wrestling. There was shooting, athletics, boxing, gymnastics, and lots of different sports. So I know lots of athletes who already been killed and sadly passed away since the war started, but still I have lots of friends who are still there.
Life for young people at the moment is absolutely terrible because they should go to school between missile attack. They should compete between missile attack, and everything this can't. It has huge influence on their psychological health. When kids are growing from 3, 6, 7 years, always in the war, they have really a big problem with health.
Welcome back to Washington and our special coverage this past hour on the world with me, Yalda Hakim. And as you can see, my colleague Mark Austin is here with me. Mark, you've been here since that assassination attempt on Donald Trump.
Yeah.
Another high drama day today with Benjamin Netanyahu here.
Yeah.
Just enough to haunt Joe Biden in the past 9 months that he's had with him.
Just trying to steal his thunder. I mean, Biden's got this big speech tonight, but Benjamin Netanyahu's speech was very interesting for what he didn't say, really. There was no mention of a ceasefire. There was no mention of a way out of all this. There was no mention of a hostage deal. But he did quite interestingly talk about the future. And he said a new Gaza can emerge. And he said it would be a demilitarized Gaza administered by Palestinians, but under Israeli military control. He said Israel must have overriding security control. Now, this gets to the very nub of it, because the Americans are saying neither Hamas nor the Israelis should have control in Gaza going forward. So there was certainly no mention of Gaza being reunited with the West Bank. There was certainly no mention of any future Palestinian state. There was certainly no mention of any two-state solution. So it's difficult to see where it goes from here. His plea basically was to give us the weapons to finish this.
Indeed, it's almost like a parallel conversation that he's having. He is going to meet with Joe Biden. He talked about knowing Joe Biden for decades and thanked him for the assistance and support that he's provided. Israel, don't forget Joe Biden at the very beginning of the events of the last 9 months, after October 7, the way that Israel felt devastated. Joe Biden arrived there and gave Israel a bear hug and said, "We are here with you."
Yeah.
In those 9 months, so much happened. We saw the protests we're seeing today very much remind us of the kind of protests we saw in college campuses, outside college campuses, students being arrested, showing us the divisions of this nation over this conflict.
It's very interesting as well that Joe Biden will be meeting Benjamin Netanyahu. And Joe Biden has got a legacy to secure. And one way he will do that, presumably, is through foreign affairs. And some sort of deal, some sort of ceasefire, some sort of hostage deal that can last in the Middle East would be something for Joe Biden to shout about. Now, the problem is when you read Benjamin Netanyahu today, and when you get, the feeling of Benjamin Netanyahu, where he is in all this, and the fact that perhaps he just wants to stay in power politically because of all the problems he could face if he's not in power, you just get the feeling that President Biden will find it very difficult to pull it off. And, interestingly, Nancy Pelosi tonight called Netanyahu's speech by far the worst speech of any invited dignitary to Congress.
It's quite extraordinary, isn't it?
It is quite extraordinary. And, of course, you had all those Democrats who refused to turn up. So, look, we've had that. We've had the protests. And now we're going to have Joe Biden's address to the nation. I mean, it is quite something.
It is quite something. And of course, just to stick with Netanyahu for 1 minute, because we have about a minute, he is going to go and see Donald Trump on Friday.
Yeah.
He is hedging his bets here. He's thanking Joe Biden, but he's also going to someone...
Banking, perhaps, on Donald Trump being the next president of the United States. Well, I mean, this is the situation we're in. I mean, this is the situation that Benjamin Netanyahu has landed in here. Utter political turmoil, utter political uncertainty. So, where it all goes from here is really anyone's guess.
Yeah, and we continue to see a roll call of world leaders reaching out to Donald Trump as well. Now, we saw President Zelensky ring Donald Trump, Netanyahu making his way to Mar-a-Lago, to Florida, to go... perhaps kiss the ring like we saw all the Republicans do last week, because this election could go any which way now. We will, of course, be following all of the developments here in Washington and again for the election in November. Well, so much has happened in the last week or so. We're going to leave you with some of the images that we've seen here today from Washington of those demonstrations.